Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you, of course, for tuning into the show. Hello, and how are you, E.C.?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm excited to get into this. We're talking about another book. It's kind of, I don't know if we call these book reviews, but we call them book deep dives because that's more like what we do here. Yeah. So we're going to talk about the book Good Energy and explore why simplicity might be the key to better health outcomes in an increasingly complex wellness landscape. We're going to talk about how the endless pursuit of optimization can actually harm our health goals, why focusing on basic metabolic markers matter more than chasing the latest health trends, the importance of addressing fundamental health factors before diving into advanced interventions. And the big question we're trying to answer with this episode is, in a world of endless health advice, how do we separate what really matters from what doesn't? Okay, Good Energy. Let's start with just some background on this book. What is it? Where is it coming from? Are you getting a lot of people asking about it? Or is it kind of the new, everybody needs to read this because it's amazing type thing?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has a lot of attention. It is a New York Times bestseller. So I have gotten a good number of questions about it, and definitely people were interested that I was reading it. So it is a book by Dr. Casey Means called Good Energy. And I guess the punchline is, which maybe people will just turn off the podcast after this, is I think it's a book you can skip. The good points, I think you...
All right, thank you so much for listening.
That was a good show. That's a wrap. I think the good points... people already know by listening to this podcast. And I think the bad points will just take you down all these unnecessary rabbit holes, in my opinion. So, it's this MD who kind of has become jaded or disillusioned with their career choice. I think we've heard this before. But then they make this switch to only nutrition and all natural as the answer to solve everything. And I want to be sure that people know this. I think they probably do, but I agree with her in the sense I think a lot of people would be better off if they focus on things like whole foods and exercise and the stuff that we talk about in literally over 200 podcasts at this point. But what I disagree with is all the details and the ways that she suggests to do that, what is actually necessary. And also disregarding the millions of people who get sick despite eating right, exercising, and doing all of the right things. So it's a few good points about the basics that you know, and then I think they're jumbled with this unproven science throughout the book. And jumble is really the word that I kept coming back to while reading it. It's like, okay, that's a great sentence, and then it's followed by a sentence that's like totally incorrect. So from a layperson perspective, I think you're actually going to be worse off than where you started because it's sort of this confusing book. Now, what's tough about reviewing this book is Casey did lose her mom not too many years ago to pancreatic cancer, and I think she carries a lot of grief, maybe guilt about her death. This is all shared openly in the book. It was a very traumatic loss. Her mom, just living her normal day-to-day life, basically had stomach pain, got CT scans, and was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, dying 13 days later. So she was only 71 at the time, and it's super traumatizing, devastating, and I'm really sorry that happened to Casey and her family. So as much as I would like to not have to dissect a personal and tragic event like that, Casey does bring up her mom as an example a lot throughout the book. So it kind of have to address some of the science around her death because I think it's important that people have the right takeaways. The book's opening dedication is to her mom, and she mentions that she dies from pancreatic cancer. And then in parentheses after that, she says a preventable metabolic condition. Already right there, I'd already sort of put a caveat, and I would put maybe, sometimes a preventable metabolic condition. There are people, as I mentioned, who have done all the right things. They've eaten right, they've stayed healthy, they've exercised, and they still develop cancer. Not everything is preventable. And it's statements like that are problematic because then people have this incredible shame when they get cancer, thinking they just need to eat one more avocado or something, right? Or they think they can cure their cancer diagnosis with just eating more vegetables. Susan Ann Summers is a famous personality who died refusing chemotherapy. I just saw more recently some MTV personality kind of progress to stage 4 breast cancer because they refused treatment at stage 3. And it's just really sad to see. I mean, I can't guarantee that these people would improve with our conventional medicine, but they certainly would have had a better shot than ignoring it entirely. So is it possible that her mother's cancer could have been prevented? Yes. Is it possible that her mother's cancer could not have been prevented? Yes. Will we know? No. So that's what's really hard about this is we want to push people towards doing all of these right behaviors, but we also want to push people to thinking that's the only way to go about these various conditions. Now, what's also interesting is we do come to learn that her mom had several risk factors. For one, she was a smoker for 30 years. Smokers are twice as likely as non-smokers to develop pancreatic cancer. We also learn that her mom was overweight, in her words, significant excess belly fat, as well as taking medications for high cholesterol, blood pressure, and high fasting glucose, which developed from her 40s through her 60s. Basically, these are all of the markers for metabolic syndrome, which also increases your pancreatic cancer risk for women by about 60%. So if her mom's pancreatic cancer was preventable, the risk factors were there. And she laments the fact that her mom's doctors just wanted to give her pills for the high glucose and pills for the high cholesterol. Yet she also admits that her doctor did tell her mom to eat healthier in her 40s, but sort of writes that off as any sort of valid attempt by the doctor. She also kind of puts blame on the doctor, saying that her doctors did not know that her mom's extra weight was a sign of metabolic dysfunction. And I highly doubt that. I highly doubt that the doctors did not know. I would be surprised if her doctors simply didn't focus on her mom's weight, because a lot of doctors face backlash because of this kind of push that we have in mainstream culture about weight neutrality. You know, we've talked about this before. We really have to get people to separate their worth from their weight while accepting the fact that excess weight does have health risk. In our current climate, many doctors are told not to talk about weight. In fact, I've interacted with some because it's so sensitive. And so many doctors have sort of been prevented from addressing this really big health risk for people because of the cultural backlash and the fact that patient satisfaction surveys play a huge role in their job performance. So when your doctor says you need to eat healthier and you come back the same weight, I don't know what you expect them to do. Your doctor is not a nutritionist. Your doctor is not a nutrition coach. Their tools are medications, and they certainly will lower your risk relative to not doing anything. Yes, it would be better to lose weight, to eat fruits and vegetables, to exercise, but if you show up at the next appointment and you're the same, they really don't have another option. So I go through all of that because there were many red flags for her mom, and that her mom wasn't really on the most health protective trajectory. And I'm sure that's hard to hear if you weren't aware that those were risk factors, but certainly the risk factors were there in terms of prevention.
Okay, let's jump into some more specifics about the book. And I think the first question I would have, is not having read this, is what does the title mean? What is good energy?
What is good energy? I want that.
I'm signing up for that.
Good energy is her term for metabolic health. And metabolic health is just a reflection of how your metabolism is doing. So metabolism is just a collection of all the chemical reactions that happen all the time for us to stay alive. But really, that means the chemical reactions that we need to break down our food and to create energy, because it's the creation of energy that allows us to have a heartbeat, to breathe, to have a core temperature, to do all these really basic things, all the essential to life functions. And so when we have these biomarkers of metabolic health, like waist circumference, fasting glucose, cholesterol, triglycerides, this tells us how our metabolism is doing, how we're doing in that energy coming in, how are we breaking it down, how is that whole process going? And specifically, if those markers are too high, it's telling us, is there too much energy in the system? Because again, the energy comes in the form of food into our mouths. If we don't need all of that energy, it ends up being stored as fat in obviously excess weight gain, increasing waistlines, or it just ends up in circulation because it's not able to get into fat cells when we have high glucose and we have triglycerides. Now, our audience should know by now that there are some genetic influences where sometimes people will have these high markers, like high glucose, like high cholesterol, that isn't really due to excess food or energy consumption. But in many, many, many cases in the US, really anywhere with a processed diet, these markers are high because we are eating too much. Sure, there's some genetic cases where it's not about diet excess, but of course in our modern food environment, a lot of cases are because of too much energy coming in. Now, why she needs to call this good energy instead of metabolic health, I don't know. I'm never a big fan of just renaming things. She goes on to kind of say it's this bad energy, this overconsumption that's the root of diseases. I think she needs some nuance here, kind of what I alluded to in our opening. Like chapter 2 is called, quote, bad energy is the root of disease. I think it would be more accurate to say excess energy consumption is the root of many diseases. not as catchy. But her whole kind of premise is, and this is really the opening few chapters, is she tries to link this concept of bad energy to literally everything from heart disease to cancer to infertility to acne to back pain to fatigue to depression to IBS, and on and on and on we go. And I think this is where she has probably some lack of experience, to be perfectly honest, on the preventative side of things. She must not be aware of the countless stories of people who have disease like cancer, autoimmunity, fatigue, acne, IBS, you name it, of people who have done all of the right things and still have those conditions. And in fact, a lot of the people that I have worked with, actually, more on the preventative side of house, who have literally obsessed over every aspect of their diet and only developed neuroses and not actually improved their disease or quality of life. So yes, I agree with her again that there's a huge number of people who could reverse or prevent some of the diseases or even just have a higher quality of life with the disease they have. But we need to be careful from jumping from one extreme to the other of like, okay, not focusing on nutrition to then thinking that nutrition can solve everything. When in reality, of course, there's a middle ground there where nutrition can do a lot, but we also want to have conventional medicine step in.
Does she offer any ways to really measure, I guess in her trade, like, can you measure good energy versus bad energy?
Yeah, really, we'd be looking at our classic measures of metabolic health. Now, we don't have a consensus. This is actually a topic of an old podcast of ours. We don't have a good consensus of what really defines metabolic health because classically, conventional medicine will pick cut points at which they define disease. Yep. Right? Okay, at this point is when we need to intervene, right? So there hasn't been kind of this official consensus of what markers exactly, make somebody, quote, optimally healthy. In that old podcast, we looked at one that said, hey, let's look at 5 or 6 markers, and only, I think it was like 12% of Americans were considered metabolically healthy and be able to meet them. So interestingly enough, in this book, she has a more recent study. It's a bigger study, which is very similar, looked at a collection of metabolic health markers and finds that only 6.8% of US adults had this optimal cardiometabolic health. It's the O'Hearn paper, I think, in the show notes from 2022. Now, for the book, she actually simplifies the criteria used in the study, but nevertheless, we don't have 10 hours here. Basically, what she's saying to define optimal metabolic health based on the study, this would be people having optimal waist circumference, which for men is less than 102 centimeters and less than 88 centimeters for women, having fasting glucose less than 100 milligrams per deciliter, having blood pressure is the third criteria, less than 120/80, having triglycerides that are less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. And then HDL, that's the only marker that we typically want to see go up instead of down. We want to have more than 40 milligrams per deciliter for men and then 50 for women. Now, the percentage of people, this is what's crazy, meeting all of those criteria, those 5 criteria, waist circumference, fasting glucose, blood pressure, triglycerides, and HDL, without medication in the US is 6.8%, about 7%. I mean, super, super low. So I want to kind of parlay this into how the book has this mixture of kind of good information followed by less good information. Like I said, we've got 7% of Americans meeting 5 basic biomarkers without medication. Like, that is an extremely low percentage. In addition to those 5 biomarkers, she spends a chapter to go on to all of these other recommended tests. Like, you need to have fasting insulin also, and you need to do this measure of inflammation, and you need to get uric acid tested, and all these other tests. And then she also even promotes different optimal ranges than necessarily what I just kind of presented above. And I'm thinking to myself, what? 93% of people are not meeting super basic health markers, and now we're going to go on to suggest all of this litany of other markers that we need to pay attention to. In my opinion, it's a classic overcomplication of a problem, classic example of unnecessarily chasing this illusion of optimization. We've got 5 routine, validated health markers that for all intents and purposes, no one is meeting without medication. Why do we need more markers? What, we're going to get another marker? Oh, yep, you're still not healthy. I mean, it's just like, what are we doing? I think it's really trying to complicate something that could be a more simple solution. Now, she also has a list of 10 different factors that are contributing to this bad energy and to contributing to these poor health markers. And some of these 10, again, I'm totally on board with. She'll talk about overnutrition or overeating. Interestingly, she never really talks about calories. We'll come back to that. But anyway, she talks about we're overeating. She talks about, hey, lack of quality. We don't have a lot of vitamins and minerals. We're not exercising enough. We're not sleeping enough. And all of these things are contributing to us having this poor metabolic health. That's all great stuff. But in the same list of, hey, we're not exercising enough, hey, we're not eating high quality foods, we have things like number 8 on this list of 10, environmental toxins and pollutants. Now, yeah, she talks about let's cut back on smoking and alcohol, which I think is all well, fine and good. But she also in the same sentence segues into, okay, now we also have to worry about chemicals in our plastic containers and nonstick cookware. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, somebody stopping overconsumption of alcohol or stopping smoking is way, 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 way more useful for their health than telling somebody they have to like switch out all of their cookware. So we have this big toxin bucket that she's blaming our metabolic health on, but yet it's kind of drawing us into the weeds of things that don't really matter. Similarly, number 9 on the list is circadian rhythm and how we all need to go view sunlight early in the morning. And 10 is we need to be exposing ourselves to a wider range of temperatures. All right, whatever. It's on the same list as like, don't consume too many calories. And I'm thinking to myself, this is exactly the type of thing that pushes people to major in the minors. We have people wearing blue light glasses, waking up with the sunrise, buying new cookware, eating organic tortilla chips, but they're still not exercising regularly and they still have no control of their total calorie consumption, right?
Can we maybe dive into what we always talk about here, which is the nutrition side of things? I imagine, you mentioned some of that list was quality of food, et cetera, et cetera. So what are her prescriptions, if that's the right word, her principles around nutrition?
Yeah. So she's got 6 principles of good energy eating and, going through each one and explaining the nuance of I agree with this part and not this part. Okay, we just don't really have the time. In the lead up to her kind of laying out the principles, she writes some things that really form the basis of my main disagreements. And so from page 116, quote, we need to stop falling into traps of dietary philosophies and start breaking food into its individual parts and analyzing whether those parts are good or bad for our cells. Food is nothing more than a set of molecular components, and whether those components meet our cells' needs largely determines our health. End quote. Now, that quote then leads into this example. She talks about, okay, she's trying to illustrate this point of breaking things down into parts of how water is good for you and will hydrate you, but water mixed with arsenic, the heavy metal, will kill you. She also then parlays it into an example of beef burgers from industrial farms are so different nutritionally than grass-fed burgers. And I'm just thinking to myself, oh God, here we go, right? This is a great example of the good information mixed with the bad information. Tearing food down into its individual components is how and why people stop eating fruit because of, quote, sugar. It's because they don't see the whole food. They don't see that the other components of the sugar are mixed with water and fiber, and that entire food package is what makes the dose of sugar not problematic, and in fact, it makes the overall food healthy. And so really, when we have to look at food, we have to consider that the whole might be greater than the sum of its parts, when in reality, she's suggesting we only can look at the individual constituents in and of themselves to make a decision about the better and worse food. And it kind of totally skips the whole concept of dose, which is the second name of this podcast, right? Even in her water and arsenic example, there is a dose of water that is harmful. Water is not always healthy and does not always hydrate you. There is a dose of water which is a problem. There's also a dose of arsenic that will not kill you. Please don't try it. But the point is, we kind of skip that whole thing. She's kind of looking at this as black or white, yes or no presence or not, and that's going to be her judge of good nutrition. Now, what's also really ironic is throughout the book, I do agree with her. She correctly identifies we have what she keeps saying, overnutrition. It's overeating. It's a risk factor disease. Yes, I agree with her there, but I never really saw her discuss how to measure this overnutrition. She's really fixated on quantification in your diet. We'll talk about continuous glucose monitoring in a second, but she talked about all those optimization of the different better biomarkers, right? But where's the quantification on overnutrition? Where's the discussion of what the proper dose of nutrients would be, aka calories and macros and micros? Where's the measure of the actual diet, the thing that precedes and directly influences all of this biomarker obsession? She's kind of focusing on the thing downrange. Now, ultimately, even though I don't agree with a lot of her principles, principle number 5 is basically what saves her principles in totality, because principle number 5 is focus on unprocessed food. So you can almost say anything in nutrition. If you get people eating more unprocessed food, the plan is going to work. You can blame it on seed oils. You can blame it on insulin spikes. You can blame it on, I don't know, toxins. If at the end of the day, people are eating more whole unprocessed foods than not, you're going to move the needle towards better. I don't have to agree with all of her principles, yet if people follow some of the recipes and stuff that she puts out in the book, they're going to see results because guess what? They're eating more whole unprocessed food. That's the magic, not the other details.
Okay, you mentioned continuous glucose monitors. You wanted to hit on that. We've talked about them before, but maybe let's surface some of those agreements or disagreements as to the efficacy of continuous glucose monitors.
Yeah, she is a big proponent of continuous glucose monitors, and I think it's important to point out that she co-founded a continuous glucose monitor company called Levels. So a little bit of conflict of interest there. She founded with an aerospace engineer who I guess used to work at SpaceX, and this person kind of designed life support systems for whatever rocket ships. And of course, this idea is, these rocket ships have all of these sensors to tell you how the rocket ship was doing, and it might blow up if something gets too hot, or I don't know. I'm not the rocket designer, right? But so,
you're not a rocket surgeon, you see?
Yeah, not a rocket surgeon, but she brings up this whole thing to be like, hey, we've got all of these sensors on these rocket ships to kind of let us know before a problem occurs. And so that's really why she gets behind the continuous glucose monitoring thing. It's like, hey, it's this real-time data to make better and worse decisions. I don't agree with it. I don't recommend continuous glucose monitors for otherwise healthy individuals for a bunch of different reasons. When we have someone who is not diabetic, when they have glucose that goes up and down within normal ranges, we don't have optimal values for what those ups and downs should be. Your blood glucose does go up and down naturally, and trying to not spike your insulin or always have your glucose be lower is not necessary. We don't have evidence that that pays out in terms of reducing your disease risk or preventing any death. The second reason is if you're not an insulin-dependent diabetic, we have a wide ranges of responses in terms of our blood glucose. In fact, she cites a study that we used in the continuous glucose monitoring podcast. But otherwise healthy individuals have a really wide range where some people actually have a higher spike after eating a banana than they do after eating a cookie. And the problem with that is they could look at their data from continuous glucose monitoring and think, oh, shoot, I should be eating more cookies. When I think we all know, no, that's not the takeaway that we want people to have. Like, there's going to be this very interpersonal variation among our responses such that some people will have, quote, a bad response to good foods. So that's, again, within normal ranges, we don't really know what optimal behavior looks like. And finally, I know we've harped on this one before, but I think it's always good to bring up again, is that I think because of all the lack of the limitations around the data from continuous glucose monitoring, that ultimately it forces people into a lot of these food neuroses. They start excluding healthy foods because their blood sugar goes up. It becomes blood sugar goes up bad, when in reality, blood sugar goes up, that's probably normal in, again, otherwise healthy individuals. So that's a lot of the science behind why I don't love continuous glucose monitors. But I think this is really an interesting thing for her to recommend, partially because she slams the conventional medicine system for trying to make too much profit off of people. So it's really hard not to flinch knowing that she owns a continuous glucose monitoring. She's targeting people who don't actually need the technology. But then in addition to that, she has this whole chapter called Fearlessness, the highest level of good energy. And this is where she laments how humans, our mind and our body is constantly terrorized by negative media, and how we're hardwired to look for threats, and how we've got all these phones that we're bombarded with news and fear mongering and these clickbait headlines to really hook us. And that we use these phones so much to get through our day and to cope, and we're getting these dopamine hits, but we're also trapped into kind of this fear mongering. Okay. And you sell CGMs? Like a chapter 2 back, you're telling people, okay, we're going to monitor your real-time data with junk science on their food intake. You're basically going to fear-monger them about healthy food intake. How much of a contradiction is that from then you saying, hey, we're too wired to our phones, we're too looking for the dopamine hit, we're too keyed into our devices. And so I think that she falls directly into this camp of preying on fear-mongering and the immediate dopamine hits to sell an unproven technology under the guise of optimum health. And so to me, that chapter in particular is really quite comical.
Okay. We've talked about a number of books on the podcast before. Mostly we only talk about the ones you disagree with because that's the majority of them. Where does this, because we haven't talked about it in a while. We do have episodes in the past where you broke down a little bit more of your thinking about like, what do I look for when I read a book like this? Can you just remind us of some of those principles that we want to look out for as we read books like this, so that maybe you don't do the deep dive that you just did for us, but we can at least start to key in on, oh, that's a red flag and that's a red flag. For example, red flag is if the individual writing it is also has a company where they want to sell you the thing they're trying to convince you of, like, that's a red flag. So are there anything else that this book does that is a red flag just in principle for us to take away?
Yeah. I think a big one is the cure-all. This is going to solve everything. And just the litany of conditions from acne. I mean, she's never met somebody who's had one of these super restrictive diets and still has acne. I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, I see that, and, that's all the time. Anyway, a litany of the cure-all. I'm going to cure all autoimmunity. I'm going to cure all cancer. I'm going to cure, all of that stuff. I think that's a big one. That's a really big one. The fear-mongering is big too. Like, everything that you're doing is wrong. Everything out there is killing you. That there are some elements of that. Again, once she gets into the weeds of like the toxins and stuff like that, I think that's a big one. And I think for people just to kind of reality check themselves, how consistent am I on eating, let's just pick 800 grams of fruits and vegetables a day? How consistent am I on eating less than 50 grams of added sugar per day? That could be a good proxy for your processed food. How consistent am I on hitting the CDC guidelines of 150 minutes of aerobic exercise per week plus 2 full body strength days a week? How consistent am I on hitting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, which is recommended by the National Sleep Foundation? Like, do those 4 steps first. Fine. Go get your metabolic health ones measured. Waist circumference, fasting glucose, triglycerides, blood pressure, and HDL cholesterol. Okay, do those other things with the fruit and veggie list, the exercise list, the sleep list, and then look at your basic, really make sure that those are dialed in before you start worrying about these trendy ideas, before you start worrying about the sunlight in the morning and the cookware and, optimal health markers and continuous glucose monitoring. Like, get those in line. I have a feeling once you get those in line, all of these other details, you're not going to want to pay attention at all because you don't need them and they don't move the needle.
Thank you. See, one more book I did not have to read, thanks to you. I always appreciate that. Thank you, everybody out
Lightening the book load.
That's right. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings, for your reviews, for sharing the show with your friends. We always appreciate it when we see it, so thank you in advance. EC and I will be back soon for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.